Good morning to one and all present here today. Honorable Director Ma'am of SPA Vijayawada, Professor Dr. Meenakshi Jain Ma'am, our guest speaker for the day, Architect Nandini Somaya, Architect Poonam Verma Ma'am, Senate members, respected deans, head of department, faculties and students. On behalf of SPA Vijayawada, Department of Architecture, I would like to welcome you all to the special lecture of Knowledge Series and introduce today's guest speaker, Architect Nandini Somaya Sampath Ma'am. For, as part of the guest lecture for students of architecture and planning on the topic to see our future through our past. Architect Nandini Somaya Sampath Ma'am, the director of Mumbai-based architectural practice, Somaya and Kalappa Consultants, has been on several competition and academic jury panels and has written numerous magazines and journals on architecture, interior design, and the use of public space. Ma'am believes that as a student of a wider breadth of knowledge, architects are able to think innovatively by learning and adapting new methodologies and ways of thinking. Research based architecture is the foundation which Ma'am has established at SNK that allows for new techniques and ways of building. As a trustee of the Hekar Foundation, she was instrumental in the curation and organization of the Women in Design International Conference held in January 2020 in Mumbai. I would also like to mention here that Ma'am has received various national and international awards, including the iGen 50 Award in June 2013, that felicitated the top 50 next generation architects and designers. In January 2020, she was a speaker at TEDx SIU Pune, sharing her narrative on the changing workplace, how it has evolved over time, and what the future holds for us in this space. We are very eager and enthusiastic to hear you online today, ma'am. Thank you so much for considering our invitation. We really look forward to hearing you on the subject. Now, I would request our Honorable Director, ma'am, Professor Dr. Meenakshi Jain, ma'am, to share her views for the day and address the audience.
Uh, Hello, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
A very good morning and warm greetings to all of you. Today, we are very pleased to be among us the galaxy of women architects. We are privileged to have the presence of architect Nandini Somaya Sampath, architect Brinda Somaya, Honorable Chairperson Board of Governors, architect Poonam Verma, our Senate member and curator of the knowledge sharing series, and the distinguished expert of today's program is architect Nandini Sampath. I am very pleased to extend a very warm welcome to her and one and all present here. When India talks about women architects having contributed to society, the name of the firm that features prominently is Somaya and Kalappa Associates. Architect Nandini Sampath is the passionate director of Somaya and Kalappa Associates. I congratulate architect Nandini Sampath and architect Brinda ma'am for receiving the prestigious UNESCO Asia Pacific Award 2024 Malavari Hall Building, Seva Southern Society, Mumbai, for bringing back the building to its former glory and restoring of its historic compound for the use of the community. A lawyer turned architect, Miss Nandini, often mesmerizes the audience with her strong delivery of speech, replete with robust and firm ideology. As a trustee of Hacker Foundation, she was instrumental in the curation of Organization of Women in Design, an international conference held in January 2020 in Mumbai, which was witnessed by many faculty and students from SPA Vijayawada as well. Architect Nandini is the award recipient of prestigious iGen Award that felicitated the top 50 next generation architects and designers. She is working on the project of varied scales with the ideation of minimal intervention on the site. The intent of the firm is to make innovative use of light, water, materials, and geometry to successfully transform the tougher, tangible elements of building into softer entities. Our underlying design principles are rooted in the belief that architecture is a means to create and connect spaces between man and earth. Today, the topic of architect Nandini's talk is to see our future through our past. We welcome you, architect Nandini. I am very thankful to architect Poonam Verma for taking an initiative of curating 6 experts knowledge series. This expert talk is second in the sequence. The participating gathering, besides the faculty members, are the entire institute students from architecture and planning background. The live streaming is available for the viewers through YouTube channel as well. I'm very delighted to make a mention that the institute has expanded Its academic program grown from a small group of staff, faculty, and infrastructure facility today to a full-fledged campus which is pulsating with academic activities through the constant support of our chairperson, architect Brinda Somaya, members of the Senate board, faculty, and staff of SP Vijayawada as an educational institute. We constantly challenge ourselves to raise the bar and place ourselves at the highest standards of academic excellence in architecture and planning through innovation, inclusion, acquisition, and dissemination of knowledge using local and global practices. The today's program is one of the sincerest efforts towards this direction. I'm very pleased and humbled to announce at this platform that recently our planning students were declared as the winners among the all planning institute across the country. I wish all the students my sincerest wishes and blessings. Towards the end, I would like to recite the quote from Frank Gehry: architecture should speak of its time and place, but yearn for timelessness. With this brief note, I request Ms. Shivani to move forward with the further program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Before we begin the session, I would request everyone to kindly raise their hand through the reactions option for doubts during the session. A brief question and answer session will be taken at the end of the presentation, where on being unmuted, you will be able to ask your questions to ma'am. Ma'am, we can now begin with the session.
Good morning, everybody. It is wonderful to be here at the Knowledge Series organized by SPA Vijayawada. I would like to thank Professor Dr. Meenakshi Jain for that wonderful introduction, architect Poonam Mascarenhas for inviting me here today, Director Dr. Gupta and architect Sanjay Bhandari for assisting in organizing this today. So I look forward to sharing this next 1 hour on thoughts of the knowledge series and the topic given to me. So I'm going to try and share screen now. So today I'll be talking to you all and our topic is to see our future through our past. And as you can see, I've chosen an image here where I feel we are present. We're right in the middle. We're in the present. And how do we view the past and how do we look into the future? But the present is the strongest moment where we can make those decisions. I open with this very interesting picture. It caught my eye immediately. In 1824, the industrialist Robert Owen coined the phrase, the march of the intellect. And the meaning was that it reflected the strides made in human knowledge, the benefits of technological progress at the time, and how this progress could lead to sweeping social changes. And this was in 1824. This is one painting from a series of prints made by William P. where he depicts a variety of future transport methods. So he, in 1824, was dreaming about what the future would look like to him. And you can hear some very interesting things. There are steam horses. There is a vacuum tunnel transport. You can see it's like a tube and it's called the Grand Vacuum Tube Company. And it says that it transports people through the tube from London to Bengal. And you have flying mail carriers and these suspended hot air balloons traveling through the air. What really caught my eye is some of the architectural buildings that are juxtaposed within this image. And it was interesting to me that even though in 1824 this was their interpretation of the future, a lot of the architectural imagery is what they were familiar with. So it's interesting to note that William, even though he created all these fantastical things of the future, like the tube and these flying objects, he still brought certain architectural detailing and buildings and public buildings in many cases, as you can see here, from his time to the future. And it's really, I think, that sense of identity and that sense of comfort and that sense of representation that he brings here. Now, this is a completely opposite image, and this is by an artist called Hugh Ferris. He did it in 1929. It is called The Lure of the City, and it was in a series called The Metropolis of Tomorrow, where again they were asked to to depict the future that they saw. And you can see in his image, with this dramatic sense of light and shadow, it depicts the city strangely devoid of any people, or any solo figures are dwarfed by their surroundings. There's almost an eerie feel, and there's almost this sense of no identity at all. It's kind of almost just, as I mentioned, light and shadow. And there's a sense of corrupting, decaying failure that was often referenced to this image. So if we were to compare Heath's image with Ferris's image, I come to the quote by Robert Solow, a Nobel Prize winning economist. And he said, over the long term, places with strong distinctive identities are more likely to prosper than places without them. Every place must identify its strongest, most distinctive features and develop them, or run the risk of being all things to all persons and nothing special to any. So when I showed you the William Heath picture, I felt there was a strong identity, distinctive features, and he was developing on his time from the early 1800s. And yet when we saw Ferris's interpretation, it was almost this interpretation of a space which is all things to all person and nothing special to any. So today I'll be taking you through three parts. Part one is a little about our studio and what we do at SNK. Part touches upon our topic about economics of heritage. How do we balance this sense of economy for our countries and our world with the idea of heritage development? And finally, I'll delve into one of our projects, the Malabari Hall, which was a very special project, very close to our hearts, that I believe reflects this combination of heritage and economics. So who are we at SNK? This is some of the early brochures that were done in 1980 of our firm. You can see the image, small image there with three people working on boards. And that's really how it began, with Miss Sumaya in a garden shed at the back. And illustrations of the city would be done in the brochure to share some of the architectural works and services that we offered. We are a multidisciplinary architecture and design firm. We're based in Mumbai. We cover a wide variety of expertise, from architecture to master planning, urban design, conservation, graphic interior design, and landscape. We have about 50 people and about 25 support staff. And our people are really our core of our organization. And it is an absolute joy and privilege to work with these group of people for me every single day. I strongly believe architecture is a group sport. It is certainly not a single person, and the work we do is reflective of our SNK family. We're led by our principal architect, Mrs. Brinda Somaya, and as you can see here, during these COVID times as well, we've managed to face the challenges and continue working and deliver for our projects, even though it's remotely from home. And now we're slowly getting back to our office space. Our work is deeply rooted in an Indian ethos and an Indian architectural vocabulary. Water, walls, light, geometry, and material. These are 5 elements we integrate and are the basic foundation upon which we design. Taking each element, these are all our projects. Water, as you can see on the left, using it very sparingly. It depends on which part of India we're building in, but it can be used as a connector, as a core or a nucleus for a project. Light in India is very beautiful. It's something we are blessed with in this country. And if we use it carefully, it gives wonderful shadow, directionality, and if there is just shading provided in India, that gives a real comfort level, especially in rural areas and second and third tier cities that we build in. Walls, we have realized the importance of the exterior melding with the architectural form and the interior. They define spaces. They also allow us to work with a variety of materials. Geometry, of course, is the basis of all of architecture as a grid formation, as a formation for axis and for fragmentation. And finally, materials. In India, again, we have such a plethora of materials that we get to work with. Every day, we're learning about new ways of working with materials as we build across India. We really have the luxury of exploring the local area and understanding the knowledge base and the know-how from that area to build more appropriately, I think is the term. We've been very blessed across the 4 decades to build a very wide variety of projects. We've done educational institutions, hospitality, places of worship, cultural institutions, IT campuses. So it has allowed us to really delve into detail across a variety of verticals and bring those expertise and use them across various projects as well. We also have a foundation called HECAR. It stands for Heritage, Education, Conservation, Architecture and Restoration. We always believe that each of us should give back to our society in some way. We support the girl child in education through this foundation. And as mentioned, we also brought out the Women in Architecture and in Design 2020 Plus conference last year. So now I come to our presentation, and we start with the economics of heritage. So when I went back to the idea of what is heritage, there was a very interesting quote by the World Bank Vice President for Sustainable Development, Rachel Kite. And she talked about heritage anchoring people to their roots, that it builds self-esteem and restores dignity. Identity matters to all vibrant cities and all people. And it was very interesting to see the terms used by her, this idea of self-esteem for a group of people, the idea of restoration of dignity to a city, and of course, this sense of identity that we so strongly feel when it comes to heritage. And then when we look at economics, I'm reminded by the great Abdul Kalam and a quote he said, "We will be remembered only if we give our younger generation a prosperous and safe India, resulting out of economic prosperity coupled with civilization heritage." And here was a great man who, really had incredible depth of knowledge of economics, and at the same time, a strong realization and connection to the roots and where India has come from, and how it was enormously important that economic prosperity had to work simultaneously with civilization heritage. And this had to run hand in hand together for India to be prosperous and safe. When I started delving more into this relationship between economics and heritage, being a lawyer at one time, I find myself always going back to research. And these are just some of the papers and the sources, research that I went into. There's an incredible amount of writing done on the subject, whether it is about the value of uniqueness. There's a Journal of Cultural Heritage. There are several books brought out on the economics of uniqueness. And it was extremely interesting to see the variety of people and the thoughts that came across through this research. And I'd like to share just 3 takeaways from this particular research point that I had. It was a paper brought out by the Getty Foundation based on a meeting that they had, and they brought out a paper called Economics and Heritage Conservation. And they talk about, the first point they talk about is the value of economic thinking. And what I found very interesting, which I didn't realize, and I learned through this, was that economics is a social science. And economics sheds light on individual behavior as well as the character of society. And I found it very interesting that they connected economics with other sciences like anthropology and art history, and also conservation. The fact all these subjects are inherently connected, and that they're not as bifurcated as we stereotypically think. And so that for me was a very important takeaway. And when we look at that aspect of how economy and conservation and art history and culture grow together, I look at the city of Mumbai and how it has grown from an island into the conglomeration. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm not sure if I'm audible.
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am, you're audible. Yes, ma'am.
This transition of Mumbai, right from its economy in its early times, when the East India Company came, there was trading that began, and you saw the economy of a country developing. Of course, we were extremely rich in resources already, but also the incredible heritage and culture that was growing at the time, the architecture that was developing, and all these really happened together and simultaneously. And from a single image like this, it really captures and encapsulates those ideas of a city growing through economy, the various resources available in Mumbai at the time, and its importance as a port city as well. And today, when we see this aerial view of Mumbai, it's still a reflection of this combination of economics and development of social and conservation efforts, because you do see this incredible development that is happening, whether it's commercial, whether it's infrastructure that we're seeing everywhere. And at the same time, you see this mix of architecture and history that is almost layering the city, that tells you this story through time and the economy that it has built over time. The second point that came up in the paper, which was very interesting, was measuring heritage in terms of price. And this has always been the controversy between economics and heritage. And it is always believed that the traditional economic models, which use this idea of price, fail in an important way to analyze heritage and conservation, because heritage values cannot be put into a single traditional economic framework, nor can they be measured in monetary terms. And this is where that conflict arises, that if you look at these economic models, they're very number generated, very number based, and how do you place that value on heritage? And coming back to Mumbai again, and these are some of the reasons why it's so hard to, because you have such a variety of heritage, whether it's natural heritage, coastline, waterfronts, sanctuaries, maidans, public parks. You have cultural heritage, which is often tangible and intangibles, religion, social heritage, and a tremendous amount of arts and crafts. And then, of course, our architectural heritage, which is, of course, a physical, where you have an incredible depth of vernacular, colonial, contemporary, but also the know-how and the traditional ways of building that have come up through time. So our natural heritage in Mumbai, again, talking about whether it's the mangroves, the physical open spaces, the water, the cultural heritage, we have our wonderful Kala Ghoda festival, which happens, which brings in so many people from the state and beyond, sharing art, music, food, and all those ideas of cultural heritage coming together. And then, of course, the architectural heritage in Mumbai, which has this, as I mentioned, an incredible layering, and also coming down from buildings to the micro, which always interests me so much, is you have these incredible milestones which were built during early times, when very reflective of Roman markers, and St. Thomas Cathedral in Mumbai is considered the zero marker point. And in various points from the St. Thomas Cathedral, we have these mile markers that emerge around Mumbai. And today, fortunately, the local government is trying to see if they can save and secure some of these markers. And it's 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles from St. Thomas's Church. So again, we're losing some of these very important archaeological and pieces of history that are scattered in our city. And these are also heritage that must be preserved. So the bottom line being, we must tread our land very lightly. Of course, this really emerges right from our Vedic texts, from early religious texts. And also the importance of considering our buildings as existing embodied energy. Our buildings that exist already have an energy, and to be able to reuse them is really, enhancing and continuing to use the energy that it has. And this is what preservation and conservation really is. However, that's really not often what is happening. This is a more common picture these days, and it's unfortunate that this is the path that often is being walked upon. And of course, there is a responsibility of us as architects to question when things like this are happening in our city or just in our surroundings where we live. So we come back to that question of what is heritage? How do we define it? How do we evaluate it? How do we put a value on it? And, that becomes this evolving question. Of course, today there are lists that are made, especially in Mumbai. We have the Heritage Committee, and you have listing of buildings, which has become set a precedent for cities across India to do this, to mark the sense of heritage. The final point I want to talk about, which I took away from the research, was bridging economic and cultural approaches. So, how do we bring together this idea of economy and cultural heritage? And what I learned from some of the readings was that economics has to rework and reimagine a model to evaluate cultural and heritage. They have to think about certain values like aesthetic, symbolic, historic, and they have to go beyond this idea of pricing. And they have to recognize the public good or character of a heritage object and places. And what was very interesting was that they found that the idea of sustainability, which has of course become, the golden word and term that is so often used today, but sustainability was one idea that really was able to bring together economics and culture. And that was a way that we could balance and create a constructive relationship. So I thought that was very interesting. Sustainability is a topic that has been talked a lot about. And if you see this specific chart and you see how you have economics on one side where they talk about return, ROI, return on investment, cross value addition, you're talking about competitiveness, pricing, but how that overlaps with things like social cohesion, community participation. And that again connects with culture, where you're talking about creativity and architecture, language, and a sense of place, which again interlinks with the environment, where we're talking about preservation of embodied energy, as I talked about, life cycle prolongation. And so that it's essentially all integrated. And I reflect back on that picture of Mumbai, that old picture of Mumbai that I showed you, that black and white one, and how that picture really encapsulated all these aspects, from the culture, from the way the people were dressed, what they were wearing, to the social aspects, how they were interacting in the image with one another, the economic aspect. You could see the growth of the city, the architecture reflected it, the ports, the boat in the ports, and the environment. There was this lushness. You could make out there were resources. So it really, in a single image, you can actually encapsulate all these aspects of the city at that time, which was so interesting. So now just a small reflection on some of the projects that we have been very fortunate and privileged to do specifically in the city of Mumbai. And I think what I want to press on through a few introductions of these projects is that there's also been constantly this marriage between economics and heritage, and that there are different buildings of different levels of but should that be the only factor that allows us to protect buildings today? Or should each building be evaluated on its individual importance and relevance to the city, to the community, and to the neighborhood? So, of course, one of the examples of a public building, which is run, of course, done by looked after by the Mumbai University, but very much in the heart and core of the city is the Rajabai Tower, and we were very fortunate to work on this. And it was a very challenging project, but one we absolutely loved every minute of. It was challenging in the sense of research, analysis, all the mock-ups and the conservation process, working on incredible heights here. We were up to 160 feet here, and we had to make an entire workshop on the higher level of the clock. We had to keep the clock running during the entire week. And as you can see here, I'm also showing a picture of the clock workings inside. You can see the mechanism that had to be maintained. And here I talk about economics and the city again, because interestingly, Rajabai Tower was built out of the donation of a patron and in memory of his mother. And to me, it was, his personal economics and a gift that he gave to the city. So when we look at a building like this, of course, of incredible importance to the city, and there is no doubt that its preservation and conservation must be kept and upheld, but also what it means to invest in a structure like this and ensure it is maintained. And as you can see here, these are some of those detailed drawings that were done. The before and after pictures, an incredible process to see it transform over time. Our cities, many of the buildings are fraught with biological growth, with a lot of discoloration of the stone because of the incredible pollution. So these are all factors that need to be constantly looked after and looked into for such buildings. And the inside was an absolute joy to work on. This full entire ceiling was actually painted over, and the paint had to be very carefully scraped off, and of course exposure of this beautiful woodwork was brought to life. We're now currently working on the lighting of the Rajabai Tower. That has been very exciting, and to really make it transform from day to night, and for it to continue being a beacon in the city of Mumbai was very important to us. Bombay House was the headquarters of the Tata Group. This was another very special project for us, and it was conversion of a heritage building into a very contemporary office space. So very different conversion from Rajabai, which was a pure grade heritage one building conversion, restoration. So over here, I just wanted to also show a different typology of work that we do as a practice, and why it's important to do and address different buildings, and how each one is so subjective and very, very different. Each project that you get as a conservation architect is almost a new puzzle of sorts. This again, a beautiful building built in 1924. Again, we had the opportunity to upgrade the services, conserve and restore the facade, and completely relook at the interiors and make it very high tech for the client. And here again, I talk about economics and heritage, because I think here you had a company that could very well decide to build a brand new modern building, probably anywhere in the world, to represent their headquarters. And I thought it was so interesting that they chose their first original building, named after the city, Bombay House, as their global headquarters, and spend and invest in retelling the narrative and the story of their company through this building. And so the economics became important in that sense as well, that this was an investment that went beyond just their company, but to uphold the building within the streetscape, and also a reflection of Bombay city and old Bombay and Mumbai today. And we brought in a lot of those details into the building. So you can see there was a T sign that was actually on the facade of the building, which is very interesting. And we brought that in to all the detailing of the handles. You can see the original busts of Jamshedji Tata that were restored. They had always been in the building. They had been put back there. But of course, all the other aspects of the building had been upgraded. We also want people to know that you're in the 21st century. Because you're doing a heritage building doesn't mean that, it doesn't have to be very upgraded and with the times and the technology that is available today. And so it is a completely smart building. It works, people can work in all parts of the building, whether it's in common spaces like this or in office areas. There are absolutely no switches in any of the rooms. Everything can be controlled by a phone or an iPad, whether it's the blinds, whether it's the lighting, whether it's the temperature control, whether it is arranging for meetings, blocking rooms. So it's amazing what technology is able to do today. And finally, of course, ensuring that you like the building, you make the facade and the structure itself an important landmark that becomes inherent to the city itself. So if each owner is able to do this, in a sense, the heritage value of the city will immensely increase, and automatically the economic value, I believe. So again, what does heritage mean? I thought this was fun to share with you all. It was important that the dogs of Bombay House be rehoused in the building as well. I remember working at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning when we were doing the facade restoration, and these were the dogs who would look after us. They would work at night, and they were security dogs at night, and they'd come in during the day into the office, and we built a kennel for them, and that's where their rest time should be. So how do you define heritage? How do you define what is meaningful to a company or to a city or to a group of citizens? And it can really vary. There are intangibles and tangibles. Another interesting is academic buildings we see so many of. We did 3 of the cathedral schools, all very different buildings. But again, so I'm transitioning from quite an iconic structure like Rajabai Tower to a private conservation effort by the Tata Group, and then to an academic building by the Cathedral and John Connon schools. And still very significant, the school itself is over 150 years old. So what does it mean for children, to come back to spaces like this? As I recall, as a child, I went to Cathedral, and these are the corridors I remember, and these are the doors I remember, and I remember sitting like these children. And these are recent pictures taken of the schools, and this is the memory that we have as individuals growing up. The way we touch a staircase as we run up it, and the fact that it curves, and the wood, the texture of the wood as it runs through our hand, the patterning of flooring, and as you can see, all the furniture we had actually repurposed and has been reused for the school even today. So there is this connection and this story and this narrative that continues from the past, and yet the school is high tech, its connectivity is there, it runs as one of the leading institutions in Mumbai. Ideas, and to ensure that we're able to amalgamate these ideas and bring them together as one and give people a good and high quality of space. My final touch on culture, heritage, and economics, which was interesting, I wanted to convey through an exhibition we did. And this was in celebration of 70 years of Indian independence. It was the first international collaborative exhibition. It was done in collaboration with the CSMVS Mumbai, the Delhi National Gallery, and the British Museum in London. And we were very fortunate to be the exhibition designers for this. And here again, the entire concept that we designed was keeping in mind the Indian audience. We knew that we had a very wide variety of people. We have people coming from the villages, people who are not educated, right to PhD level curators, academicians and students, and of course, citizens as well. So you had to appeal to a wide variety of people. And so we designed it knowing that visually to be able to work your way through exhibition becomes very viable. And so we used color so that even if you could not read, you were getting an experience by being completely ensconced in an environment with beautiful objects that are telling you a story, but also design helping you to learn about that narrative. So we had various sections, and this was the first section, and you can see it was as if we were moving through time in caves, and these were the early hand axes which were millions of years old. So there is this sense of transporting people temporarily back into time, and then you move into empires, which was architecturally large, and you had architectural pieces and wonderful art pieces and stories about kings. And so we use this very rich red color to represent that richness and heritage and growth of economy and scale. And then you had state and faith, which was the introduction of religion into the world and how it's done through imagery and through physical objects. And this had to be done in a very serene way. And you can see that juxtaposition there. That's actually a Christ made of wood and Ganesh made of stone. And everybody would assume the Ganesh was Indian and the Christ was the object from the world, but the Christ is actually from Goa and the Ganesh is from Indonesia. So the stories that objects tell are amazing and must be told in this sense of layering and just reinforcing the importance of past here. And then again, we transition into courtly cultures where you enter the sense of royalty and the stories of nobility. And we end with this freedom story where you talked about emancipation and slavery, and we wanted this sense of white where people were fighting for their freedom, its sense of purity. And you can see that bust of Gandhiji there through this mesh, this idea of mesh representing, the jailed people and the people who had to fight through prosecution during this time. And we ended with being sustained back in time, where we saw this beautiful artwork by Talur, where he showed this statue of Shiva being ensconced in concrete and money. And he talks about how people are just having an obsession with development, infrastructure, see forever, because Shiva is, the god of the infinite in a sense. So he makes us reflect as human beings. Is this what our future is going to hold? And I thought that is such an interesting way to talk about this conversation today about economics and our built form and our history. You literally have it in three aspects here in this one structure. You have the concrete and the money and this beautiful sculpture ensconced in it, which reflects the heritage. So I think this one Talur statue for me really encapsulated what we're discussing today. And of course, no project is possible without an incredible team of people. And we covered 1.7 million years in 210 objects across 9 stories in one exhibition. And now coming to our beautiful Malabari Hall. And this is the story that I hope will reflect a different way in which we approach the conservation of a building that was not listed. I think all the projects I've shared with you are of quite prominent buildings that have already been marked in history to make sure they are preserved. But what about the group and collection of buildings that may not be on this listing but have such significance in a community? And I think all of us have grown up in cities, in towns, in villages, where around built forms that have meant so much during our childhood that we remember in our mind's eye. And should that not play importance to continue to save them as we look forward and become a part of this economic and heritage conversation? There are some buildings that connect us to the past and to each other, and that show us who we are. These are worth holding on to. The Malabari Hall is one such building. I first wanted to go through the process of conservation that we follow during any project. As you can see, the first process is what are the various approaches we can take towards a building, whether it's preservation, restoration, retrofitting in certain situations. Expansion is required. For example, in the cathedral schools, we have to expand some of the buildings. Part reconstruction in several cases we have done. Service upgradation, of course, because a lot of the buildings internally have grown organically over time and have often never been redone or looked at holistically. Adaptive reuse, which we're seeing so much of today, and of course the interiors. So when we look at stage 1, it really starts with the story, with the narrative, and with the research, without making the effort to look back into time and see and understand the story of the building. The solution for the building can never be formed. And so we go back and we look at cultural significance. We try and source out original and existing drawings. We research several archives, national archives as well, with respect to the buildings. And what this teaches us is the type of structure that it is, the type of material and construction that was used, the specifications and the techniques that we used. And it also allows us a little glimpse into any interventions or past works that were done. We then move on to stage 2, which is the building condition assessment and analysis. Now, whenever I talk about conservation, I always think of a building like a patient. So and we are a doctor in a sense. So when the patient comes to the doctor, we first have to examine the patient. We have to visually examine the patient and understand using tests, etc., what exactly is wrong. We have to diagnose the problem. So these are some of the ways we diagnose. We use, of course, the measure drawings and condition mapping methodologies that are used. We use architectural deviations. We use structural and material analysis, our NDT and STD testings. We also study different regulatory aspects, whether it's fire, accessibility, energy efficiency, and services analysis, extremely important, whether it's mechanical, electrical, plumbing, structure, of course. And then standards and codes, we have to be knowledgeable and up to date on those and see how we can best suit and introduce these aspects into existing building, and also look at the future needs of the client. Think ahead, think about what they may need looking forward. So this becomes this kind of medical analysis of the building. And then we go on to understanding what are the possible solutions, and we formulate a proposal. So we look at the conservation solutions, the expansion upgradation planning. We have various priority lists, what needs to go and start first as a priority, and then lay out logistics. Then we also develop a maintenance guideline. This is extremely important to ensure the longevity of the building, to make sure that the client can continue looking after the building beyond this time. And of course, the costing. A building like this had a very tight budget. It was, the owners were a NGO. So we had to be very conscious of this budget and still be able to do our best job possible for the building. Then, of course, there's client approval, statutory approval, implementation. We issue a tender, we appoint the contractor, we get into execution, site monitoring, and finally complete the project. So when we look at the location of Malabari Hall, it is in a neighborhood called Gamdevi. It's named after the 200-year-old temple dedicated to the Indian goddess Durga, and it's known by its devotees as a graceful woman. I thought that's so beautiful, Leelavati, or graceful woman. So this area of Gamdevi, just to give you a history, grew out of colonial Bombay's need for affordable, well-planned housing in the turn of the 20th century. So after the plague, the Bombay City Improvement Trust was formed, and this was created in 1898. And as the name says, the Bombay City Improvement Trust, it set out developing large plots of land on the north side of the city. And Gamdevi was situated in the northern, because the southern side, the southern tip of the island, as you see, it goes thinner as you go down, had become very overcrowded. And of course, it had just had this plague. So they were trying to ease up the overcrowding in the south side. So they began from Gamdevi right up to Dadar. These middle class neighborhoods were built, and they were very well planned, and they were community minded. So Gamdevi was attracting people who wanted single family homes, and you can see the image. This is an image of today, of course, but you can see the low rise buildings with very high density. And, you had a Gujarati diamond merchant, very famous man called Rev Shankar Javeri, who built mansions also there. And one of those beautiful mansions was Mani Bhavan, which was Gandhiji's headquarters. So as we can see here, this very interesting plan, you can see how well planned it was for its time. And it was developed with this intention of it being for a community of people with density, but low rising, but good open spaces, good circulatory spaces. There were regular plot sizes, there were height restrictions, and it was defined by scale. So there was also a range of public spaces, such as I was talking about. There was schools, there were, such as you can see, the Columbia High School for Girls. There was Wilson College very close by. Then there was, of course, Mani Bhavan, as I mentioned, which was Gandhiji's headquarters from 1917 to 1934. That's number 2 on the map. And it was a beautiful building built. And you had a range of maidans, you had police station, you can see Gamdevi police station, you had temples, you had post offices, and of course our beautiful Malabari Hall, which was built in 1924, and with the purpose of it being a multi-purpose hall. So this is a view of Malabari Hall from the main road, and this road is called the Pandita Ramabai Road, and it's very important to note the name Ramabai Road as she was very instrumental in the beginning of Seva Sadan as well. And as you can see here, it is a very dense road. There's a lot of now larger built forms coming around it. And just off Malabari Hall is some of the older roads with, you can see those smaller buildings of residential, which still continue to be residential, but give you that historical story of Gamdevi as it was planned and designed by the city trust at that time, the Bombay City Trust at the time. So you have Laburnum Marg and you have Kashibai Navrange Marg. And then these wonderful buildings, which is the Gamdevi police station with its arch colonnade, and you have Columbia High School, of course, and Mani Bhavan also with its quite ornately designed with wooden balconies and sloping Mangalore tile roofs. And of course, the Makhichan Hall, another beautiful building, all representative of the design language of Gamdevi neighborhood. And what it also gives away, the fact that Gandhiji chose this as his headquarters during that time, reflects about the social progress in the neighborhood at the time, the forward-thinking aspect of the neighborhood. They were very progressive. There were people who were thinking about the growth of the country, the economy of the country, the cultural heritage of the country, the social importance and impact of the country. So really it became a hotbed of social reform and independent thinking. Here again, you have the beautiful Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, which became a center for arts and culture. So real neighborhood with everything in it. The Arya Mahila Samaj. So again, this idea of political reform. You had Samajas coming up and buildings that were representing this. And our beautiful Malabari Hall building, you can see there on the right. So what is the story of our building, our beautiful Malabari Hall? So in 1908, for the betterment of women who were exploited and abused by the patriarchal society, a social activist named Ramabai Ranade, and that's why I requested you to remember the name of the main road, which was Ramabai, because it was named after the same social activist. And she had started the Hindu Ladies Social Club in Mumbai, which taught women how to public speak, Indian women how to public speak. She then became the president and founder of Seva Sadan Pune. And in July 1908, Shri Bairamji Malabari, who you see on the left, and right next to him, Diwan Dayaram Girumal, both got together and were inspired by Ramabai Ranade. And they started Seva Sadan to liberate, educate, and empower underprivileged women. That was really the basis for which they began Seva Sadan. It was to make women of the time industrious, to make them independent, and to instill a sense of justice and humanity at the time. And it amazes me that it was two men who, really garnered the forces and put together the society. By 1908, you can see the society provide women with life-changing skills. You can see them being educated. They were provided shelter also, food. And these were women who were coming from all parts of Maharashtra for assistance and help to the city. By 1914, there was introduction of the Ramabai Navrange Teachers Training College. So the first step towards educating women, higher education, so that they could be employed for jobs. And in 1924, the completion of the Malabari Hall building. It was designed by the architects K.P. Davar and Company, and it was inaugurated by then Governor Leslie Wilson and his wife Lady Wilson. And it was built for the construction cost of 88,000 rupees. And it was really built at a time when colonial and vernacular architecture really had its roots embedded in Mumbai. But it was post Victorian Gothic and before the period of Indo-Saracenic and Art Deco. So it was a very interesting building, with these incredible features, as you can see. And then in the 1940s, after the building was built, the Women's Society started a tiffin service. And this was very interesting. It was obviously to serve the community and beyond. So here you were not only able to give jobs to women, but you were really serving the local community as well. And they became very popular for this tiffin service in the Gamdevi area and beyond. By 1944, they started the Marathi Primary School, which was established to educate underprivileged girls. And then by the 1970s, they began a lot of skill training. So whether it was for beauty training, sewing, typing, again, giving women these variety of skills to empower them to go out and live independent lives. So by 2000, it was really required, as you can see, certain interventions were required for the building. It was certainly in a state of disrepair. As I mentioned, it is an NGO run by an NGO at the time. It had to be maintained through limited funds. And finally, there were certain interventions done. As you can see, the large openings were closed with glass blocks, and those jalis were removed. The building was given a basic facial upliftment, I would say, in the early 2000s, but not too much intervention was done. 2000 onwards, of course, we see, a huge change. There's a lot more interaction and introduction of extracurricular activities, of technology. In 2000, the Malabari Hall was originally only used as a hall for the girls, but in 2000, they opened up the hall for general public to rent the hall, to be able to also generate revenue, but also to invite the community to be a part of Seva Sadan. That became very important. So also they introduced a science laboratory in Malabari Hall. They introduced a computer lab, and the had the self-defense classes and all the classes and lectures that the girls could take. So really updating for the time that they're in. Here you can see an image of the hall pre-restoration being used for certain events and for classes for the girls. So as we can see, there are essentially 3 buildings of the Malabari, of Seva Sadan, of this entire area that's cordoned off on the campus. You have the Malabari Hall on the right, which is the core building, and it was constructed, as I mentioned, in the early 20th century. And in the middle, you have the administrative building. As the name suggests, it's where the administrative staff of Seva Sadan continue to sit and look after the trust. And finally, you have the home building. Again, as the name suggests, it's where many, many girls and women through the decades have come and stayed in Seva Sadan and have been looked after and have grown up within this compound and been a part of their life, really, this entire building. So you can see here, there's the home building on the upper left hand, the administrative building, and on the bottom right is Malabari Hall. And they really create this little courtyard in the middle, which is where you saw the girls playing, and it is really used as their semi-open space, their open space, as then it immediately falls onto the main road. So it's very fortunate that that little open space is available for Seva Sadan to use. So here you can see we did a site plan. You have Pandita Ramabai Marg really flanking it on the eastern side, and then Malabari Hall, the administrative building, the home building, and that courtyard in the center. When we zoom in on the building, this is an existing ground floor plan when we first reached there. You can see that it was essentially divided into 5 parts as such. The first was this original entrance had been changed into a cafe called the Abar Cafe. It was used by the students as well as some of the outsiders. And this was essentially a corridor, the entrance hall to the original Malabari Hall. And then the hall itself was on the ground floor level divided into 3 rooms, where you had the science lab, which I showed you images of, where the girls were sitting and doing their classes, the computer lab with a row of computers, making sure they were accessible, their access to technology was given, and the laburnum room, which was used by the trust for all their meetings or any other smaller get-togethers that they had. And of course, you can see the veranda on the left-hand side. When you went up to the first floor, there were 2 beautiful staircases that took you up to the first floor. And then you entered the Malabari Hall itself, which had the stage in the front. And there were 2 toilets that had been added on each side. They were originally changing rooms, but we found out that the toilets were originally changing rooms from how the building was originally used when it was built. And then as you move further up, there is a smaller mezzanine. On the mezzanine floor, there's a gallery that runs across the periphery of the building, from which you can look down onto the stage below. And 2 more toilet blocks were added up on that northwestern side of the building. So here again, so essentially a ground, a first, and a mezzanine. And of course, that beautiful hip roof, double hip roof of the entire building. And as we cut a section through the existing, you can really gain appreciation for the heights. You can see that laburnum room there through which they had their secondary meetings, the Malabari Hall with the beautiful metal trusses, and the gallery around that wraps around that central hall. And then that winding staircase that goes all the way up, that really becomes a feature on both sides of the building. And as you take another section slicing through, you see all the 3 rooms at the bottom, the science lab, the computer lab, the laburnum room, and Malabari Hall in all its glory on that first floor and the mezzanine floor. The stage, of course, flanked on both sides by the toilet blocks. And then we began our condition assessment. And as I said, this is as a doctor would do. You are doing a physical and certain point intrusive check of what are all the ailments of the building. So it really ranged from water-related issues to flooring issues, to structural issues. And we had to start analyzing and looking at all these different parts of the building and mapping it out in great detail. As you can see here, not just on plan, but through pictures, whether it was falling off the plaster from different parts on the wall, on the ceiling, whether it was a structural visual crack that we could see in the RCC beam. And then going back to, again, the first floor plan, understanding the various cracks that are there, understanding what parts of the facade have issues, what parts of the staircase were having issues, the ceiling. Here again, you can see a crack in the flooring here. The ceiling, there were certain issues with the beams that were coming, a huge falling of plaster. And this continued on the mezzanine as well, where you saw the false ceiling completely buckling. Again, these cracks appearing on the floor tiles. A lot of electrical conduiting, again, organically grown over time. So you see it, appearing in different parts of the building. And finally, the roof. The roof had not been touched at all since the building was built in the early 1900s. And it was very important to study the roof very carefully to see what had to be done. From underneath, we could make out there was quite a lot of water seepage, and which made it very clear that there was no kind of drain at all, and that the waterproofing had severely deteriorated over time. And this the joint between the roof and the wall is where the water seepage was occurring. So it was very apparent that, there was this ingress that had occurred over time. And of course, the facade itself, whether it's discoloration of the stone, whether it was vegetation that was appearing, of course, the plaster that was coming off, but being also sensitive to the existing color of the building, ensuring that we were in keeping with that terracotta and white finish that was already there. And you can see some of those beautiful features, whether it's the columns in the center, the triangular pediments of that time, very much reflective of that early 1900 architecture that was prevalent in the Gamdevi area and the neighborhood. Here again, the spalling, huge spalling of the exterior plaster on those beautiful external and circular columns, and even the base. And again, analyzing and making sure each one of these aspects were marked and analyzed and thought about what are the solutions going to be for each of these aspects as we were moving forward. Here again, you can see the western elevation, those junction points between the roof. There was certain banding that had been added later, as you can see, to the windows, as we recognize this from old pictures, that there was not these lower chajjas that were present on the original windows. These chajjas out of two of the windows had been extended beyond what they should have been. So these are small detailings that we noted and marked down that were very carefully mapped in all these aspects. The south elevation, you can see huge rising of damp here, and again that corrosion of the drainage line. There were a lot of ODUs also and drainage pipes that had been brought out, and of course the roof defects because of that leakage that was occurring. Then we also had to test the plaster from the facade. So we actually removed a bit of the lime plaster, had it tested in a lab, understood, what was the breakup of it, that confirmed that it was lime plaster, and understood how we had to repair it. And this was important because what we realized was on the north, east, and south facades, it was a lime plaster. However, on the western facade, when we tested it, we realized it was actually cement plaster because there were interventions that were done at a later time where then cement plaster had been put on top. And we had to be so careful because if you try and remove cement plaster, the entire brick material ends up coming off. So it is better to restore, on top of it, then remove it. But if we had not checked each side, we wouldn't have known. So you cannot ever assume that there's a continuity of a material on each part of the building. You have to make sure that you test each part. And, even before checking the pH value using the pH meter of the lime plaster itself, and then we realized there was no rainwater gutter on the roof, and it was extremely important that on this northeast side that the rainwater be taken out and rechanneled back carefully using the downtake pipes. So again, the introduction of this rainwater gutter, making sure several mock-ups were done carefully using cardboard sheets to ensure that it worked and integrated well. So then we proposed, this was a proposed ground floor plan. You can see here, it was a faithful restoration. None of the usage of spaces were changing. We were just going to remove the cafe and restore the entrance lobby as it was. You can see adding of lighting in these spaces. There were beautiful existing Hundi lights. We wanted to make sure that we took those off, restored them, and whatever we added on as well were locally sourced and made in the same family of the original lights as well. So being sensitive to what is there, ensuring we could remove and restore what was there, and even your additions had to be reflective of the design that existed. Here again, you can see restoration of the hall as is. We decided to convert one of the toilets into a waiting area. That would proved very useful for the people using the hall. But what we did was we ensured we left the plumbing pipes there so that if they ever wanted to convert it back into a toilet, they could do so. So just understanding again this idea of future usage, could that change? And if they wanted the flexibility to do that, that we should allow for that. And then finally, that beautiful mezzanine floor, which had the wooden balustrades, and you could see that the metal trusses from there. So beautiful view from that top section, and we kept the toilets as well. And again, looking very carefully at the roof again, and studying and making sure how we could ensure there was no further water seepage, but also just removing the roof tiles, cleaning them, and only replacing the ones that were broken. It was essential that there wasn't, a complete removal and just replacement of items. Again, here a section you can see we wanted to introduce lighting from the metal trusses, very important because there was a reduced amount of lighting within the hall. So to make sure it was an ambient space, that introduction of lighting with better wattage, but again using locals to make the lighting. We actually use recycled glass as well. So that were very important aspects, and reusing the original Hundi lights on the ground floor where we reintroduced the entrance lobby. Here again, a section, and you can see that a gallery section on top on the mezzanine, the Malabar Hall, and then the bottom rooms. And finally, the stage, we wanted it to have the logo of Seva Sadan, which is the blooming lotus. And you can see that in a gold finish, and very neatly done and finished within cost and budget is what we proposed. And the external elevation, really bringing it back to its early 1900 days, to the way that the community remembers it, in that wonderful terracotta color and white, and that lime plaster that reflects through. So these were all the aspects. You can see that little dome on the left hand side there, that also had a China mosaic in the dome area, which was very cracked. That also had to be addressed and filled in. So here again, really cleaning up the elevation as best as possible, and finally giving that touch of facade lighting at the end, and on that signage, so that again it becomes a little gem in the neighborhood, which is noticed, that you would want to know about the story of this building when you pass Gamdevi. Again, exterior signage, just very simply the name Malabari Hall put back there. So as you can see here, some pictures of our phase 1 work in progress, and the north facade plaster being removed, the testing after being done, the final coats being applied on the north facade. And then you can see here quite a challenging job we had to work through. Of course, the usual monsoons, etc. The grouting of cracks as well was done. This was on the western facade, as I was telling you, where we found cement plaster. So here again, we didn't remove, we applied and repaired what was there. The exterior beam repair on the eastern facade, which was really in quite a bad shape when we reached. That small ledge wall that had been added on later had been removed on the southern facade. So all the windows were restored back to their original intent of design. And here you can see us checking the pH value, because we decided to use a neutral paint over the lime plaster. The original intent was to do a lime wash, but it was exorbitantly expensive and could not be afforded. So a very good paint, a neutral paint was used, which works very well and allows for the breathability of the wall. So, but we had to ensure that the lime plaster was neutralized prior to the application of the paint. And so this was done on those walls. Of course, loose plaster removal. As you go into the interiors and in the entrance lobby areas, the existing RCC beam repairs, ensuring they are supported, and our engineers were very methodical to ensure these were done. Replastering of surfaces right from all the ceilings, you can see that happening. And finally, when we go back onto the top of that roof, you can see the removal of the existing waterproofing that is there. And the roof was experiencing a lot of seepage, and we removed and replaced the existing waterproofing, but the new waterproofing that we put in, which was a tactic polypropylene, was of the same family of the original waterproofing. So again, making sure that there is a sense of continuity in specifications of materials. And again, here you can see the gutter. We introduced the GI gutter, and then replacement, cleaning, and replacement of the existing tiles, and addition of only broken tiles that were there. Again, there were wood roof pillars in the junction points that had rotted. This was again due to the water seepage. They were removed and replaced with equivalent wood. And also at the junctions of the old and new members, these were kept intact by introducing a metal plate. So you can see here, metal plates were anchored on either side of the wooden members to provide support. So again, introducing it in a way to ensure longevity of the building. Again, replacing damaged roof planks which had occurred due to the leakage, and that installation of the GI gutter, because as I mentioned, there was no outlet for rainwater, and that had caused the seepage. And after several mock-ups, we were able to install the GI gutter. The grouting work on the China mosaic in the dome area, which I mentioned to you, which also had to be repaired. And finally, when we go into the interiors, you can see the loose plaster was identified using the tapping method. Then it was removed. Props were placed on the floor, as you can see on the floor slab, and it was replastered. And modifications of the toilet, as I mentioned, back into a waiting area. And again, ensuring that we kept all those pipes so that if they wanted to turn it back, it was possible. The rearrangement of the beautiful cement tiles in the waiting area. They were cleaned. There were some cracks on the floor. We learned that the hall had a separation joint in the floor, and a certain structural crack was identified. So 4 tiles had to be removed. Those tiles during remove were replaced by new tiles, but even the only 4 new tiles were put back, and they were stained and lacquered and replaced as the original tiles in the same pattern and the same color. And here you can see on the mezzanine a scraping of the wood from the balustrades and the gallery. So the handrail and the posts were brought back to the wood, and the balustrades were repainted. Revamping of that false ceiling, of course, in the toilets and mezzanine. And this is pre and post restoration. You can see, that lime plaster, the facade really coming to life. There's a great simplicity in the buildings, but if you look carefully at her, there are beautiful details that come to life. And, it really takes you back to a time of that detailing, of simple detailing, and the fact that there was accentuation of openings with the banding, and the introduction of some of these interesting Art Deco elements that come in, and the beautiful arches as well in that common courtyard. So you can see just a small interventions, but important interventions in the long run that we hope will, the client is able to upkeep. And here you can see on the left was the original cafe that was in that corridor, and we removed the cafe, and we wanted to make this an introductory space to people who came to the hall. So we put in archival photos in the whole space eventually. And the staircase, after it was restored, we restored the plaque when it was inaugurated by the Governor Wilson. This was the tile restoration. The ceilings, of course, the wirings, cleaning of the glass blocks. These were the junction points where there was extreme water leakage, ensuring those were attended to. And of course, that main stage, which was such a joy to see after it being done with the new lighting also introduced. And the mezzanine on top with the gallery sections, and the new recycle lighting that was brought in the same pattern and design as the originals. And this is as you are standing in the corridor looking at the stage, and the main doors are open, and it's such a special space to be in. Sometimes you're really transported to a different time. You feel as the children are performing. It's a very intimate space. It holds about 250 people at its maximum capacity. And it's a wonderfully intimate space where performances are done. And there on the left, you can see that blooming lotus, which is the logo of Seva Sadan Trust. And again, the wooden handrail and posts that had been polished, and the balustrades again that had been painted, and the main stage. And the hall really transforms through the day. During the day, it's very bright, light, and by the time the evening comes, there's a certain beautiful aura that comes to light, a spirit of the place, especially with the lighting that we had introduced. And the glass blocks bring in this ambient light, which is great from the outside into the corridor. And again, another view of the other side staircase that brings you up. And this is the ground floor entrance to the 3 rooms, the science, the laburnum room, and the computer room. Another beautiful detail there of the lighting juxtaposed with the glass blocks. And here again, I go back to that point of, do we have a responsibility as citizens and architects to find importance in buildings such as this, which is not listed, which has an incredible story, that serves the community and, serves the empowerment of women at large. So does it become economically important to regenerate this building and make sure it becomes a landmark of the area? It's important to point out here that in 2018, the Jones Day Foundation had visited the Malabari Hall before the restoration, of course, and they had fallen in love with the story and the almost simplicity and beauty of the building. And it was the Jones Day Foundation that donated the money, which made it possible to restore and refurbish the hall. So we're very fortunate that it's almost circumstances that allow for these stories to be made. And as you can see here, I thought this was a beautiful juxtaposition. This was in 1924 when Seva Sadan opened at Malabari Hall on the left. And on the right is Mrs. Advani, the president of Seva Sadan, who inaugurated the Malabari Hall on the opening, which was done on their Founders' Day. So, the story still continues, over 180 years later. And what an amazing story to tell as you see this transitioning happening. The students put on a beautiful program for us. There were plays and dances and songs, and it was a very, very special moment to see them on stage and watching that building really come should be used all these years. No project is possible without an incredible team of people. The clients, Mrs. Gudi Advani, the president of Seva Sadan, Mrs. Umaima Mullah Feroz, the joint honorary secretary of Seva Sadan, they put their immense trust and faith in us. And, really, without their support, this would not have been possible. Our team at SNK, and of course, the consultants and contractors who were really responsible in bringing it to life with us. We were very fortunate in 2020 that this project was awarded the UNESCO Asia Pacific Award for Cultural Heritage and Conservation, the Award of Merit. And it was so special because I think it recognizes the importance, the social importance that this building plays in the neighborhood. That it brings together community in spite of the development that is taking place, in spite of the fact that it is on the fringes of the heritage precinct at Gamdevi, in spite of the fact it's not a listed building and run by a small NGO, but its great importance in the story of the city, in the story of the neighborhood, and in the lives of women in the area, and what it's doing for empowering women from a level of the trust's work is so important. So I end with the same picture I started with, that we are here. We are in the present. The path to our future passes through our past, and the present is the time to act. So I hope that we all as architects can be in the present, appreciate research, study, and really relish the past, but really be guardians of the past and take it to the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for the immensely informative session. We will now be moving to the question and answer session that we have for all the doubts that our students have from you. And anyone who has a doubt can raise their hand from the reactions option, and we will unmute you accordingly. Okay, so I can see the first question from Janvi. So I'll just unmute you. Sir, Sanjay sir, can you unmute Janvi?
Yeah, she can unmute herself. I have already asked her.
Okay,
Hello.
thank you.
Hello.
Hi,
Am I
Jan.
audible? Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the great session. It was informative. My question is, as you mentioned, there has to be a sustainable development always, and it is also important to be in the current time as well. So, while dealing with any conservation project or any heritage building, how can we be intact with the original values and maintain it based on the raising economic values which you talked about? So that's what my question is.
Okay, so Janvi, I'm just going to see if I understand you correctly. I think what you're trying to ask me is during the conservation process, how do we integrate the requirements of today and still make it economically viable for today while still preserving some of those aspects of what has gone before? Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely correct.
Okay, so I think that's the puzzle, right? That's why we all love conservation. I mean, and I think every conservation architect, that's the puzzle you have to solve. So the joy lies in the research, in learning the history, and you're really learning the story. The building tells you its story. I mean, that's the beauty. It tells you through its material. It tells you through, the photographs. It tells you to the drawings. It tells you when you walk around it, how it's being used. And then you have to, of course, who is your user? You then have to collaborate and interact very closely with the user, understand what your program of requirements are. And of course, we have such a wide variety of buildings that we can conserve today. So what is whether it's a graded structure, whether it is something that is not graded at all, like the Malabari Hall, but what kind of interventions will have to be taken will be based on that graded aspect of it. And then how you integrate all the requirements of today, whether it's services, whether it's technology, all these things today are prerequisites for all aspects of buildings. So this has to be done very carefully. I'll give you an example. I recall in Rajabai Tower, we had to introduce some electrical conduiting, and we love going into old buildings and seeing all this exposed electricals everywhere. I mean, it's one of the things I enjoy photographing and I keep a record. And we were wondering, how do we get the electrical wiring into the building without intervening too much with the structure? And what we found piped gas pipes. Essentially, in the old days, all the electricity used to be powered through gas, and so the entire Rajabai Tower had these gas pipes that were connected to the electrical points, which were then leading to the outlets. So the most beautiful way was to run the wiring through the existing pipes that were there, that were not being utilized. And it was just one of those things where you're looking, and you think, oh my God, it's a eureka moment, and why don't we do something like that? So the points being that I think conservation, old buildings, you're always finding something new. I remember opening plaster, you'll find beautiful tiles. Or I remember in cathedral, we were breaking down a wall. We actually found a small parish behind an old wall. It was hidden there. I mean, these are the most exciting stories that unveil themselves. So you have to balance all that you find, bring in creative, innovative solutions using the old but integrating the new. So I think there's, again, no one solution. As I said, it's a puzzle. That's the fun of conservation. And every conservation architect, I think, are great 3D puzzle makers. They're able to put it all together.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll just see who else has raised the hand for a question. Anyone who wishes to ask a question can raise the hand. Any student, faculty member, anybody who wishes to ask a question.
I think, Shivani, it was very, very captivating and inspiring.
Yes, ma'am.
And very, very explanatory already. I think there are no questions from the audience probably.
all the time.
Explain, Nandini. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm really impressed. I mean, highly impressed. I think Poonam, Dr. Architect Poonam has to say something about this.
I didn't want to, but I'm going to jump in because this gives me a chance. So, what is fantastic about this project is it's unlisted. So it's really, you took it on as a responsibility to create that narration. And what was the response of the students to your work? Because they are the actual users. I would like you to share those stories because those are the heartwarming stories, no?
Absolutely. I mean, you really do these spaces to see how they're being used. Once they're used, you really understand the stories that are going to happen beyond that. And I think the Trust does such inspiring work, and these girls are incredible. I mean, they're talented. They're so aware of politics, of social, of technology. I mean, it's a different world we're living in, and to be able to give them the facilities to really grow in, and they're so proud of it. I mean, they were emotional when they saw it. Some of them were crying. They couldn't believe the transformation, and they consider it theirs. There's such pride in their building because for them, the building is their home. It is their space of security. It teaches them their life skills. And so it becomes very ingrained, I feel, in their mind's eye in many ways. It's the memories that they take with them. And it was also really interesting because a lot of alumni, girls who had passed out of Seva Sadan came back, and they were so emotional, and they'd see the space and they were nostalgic about how they used it and how this is different and how lucky the younger ones are. And it's amazing to seeing them as working women, and they come in. So I think there's a parallel story, that the work that they're doing for the girls that are there, the women that have gone before, and the history of the women and the men who have really supported it, the building is telling that story. And the fact that it can continue to do that for however many more years is really a privilege for us to be a part of.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you, ma'am. We have another question now. So, I'll just.
Good morning, ma'am.
Morning.
Ma'am, thank you for this wonderful session. I guess we all really enjoyed it. But, ma'am, I have a question regarding the Bombay House project. I like that project, but since it was a conservation project, so conservation architects tend to maintain the fabric or the original state of the structure, so that we could understand what was the past. So in this Bombay House, as we saw, the interiors were upgraded, like it had a look of modern architecture. So do you think I mean with all due respect, do you think it did a justice to maintain that heritage fabric? Because everything was like you told, that everything was operated via iPads and all the latest devices. So do you think, like, that is my question?
Yeah, and that's a very fair question. And what I didn't have time to show you was the pictures of the interiors before we took the building. So I think it's important to see what is the existing, right? So of course, Bombay House, beautiful exteriors. We were very fortunate to get such a beautiful building to work with. But what had happened in the interiors is there were about 8 or 9 companies, and they had all grown organically over many, many years. So if you went inside, it was like being in one different office and another different office, and there was a storeroom, and then so it was not actually there was one beautiful old conference room on the 4th floor which had been preserved as is from the original day, but beyond that there was no original features that had remained in the building. There had been several interventions by each company, by their own design, to come and introduce workstations, cabins, and this had evolved. So there was in all fairness, there was not much to preserve in the interiors. There was certainly the conference room. And I think we wanted to bring back some of the original spaces actually, which we were able to do. Because in the planning, one of the first things we did was we opened up a lot of the common spaces. What had happened was these offices had become rabbit holes. You know how offices become, they keep becoming smaller and smaller, like a little, you go into one corridor down to the other. So what we did was, by some amount of good planning, you open up common spaces and you design appropriately to make sure wayfinding and directionality works well. So that occurred very well throughout all the four. As in, we restored the original boardroom and the conference room as is. It has beautiful wood paneling. It had the original paintings of all the founders. There was a beautiful original table that was restored. Even technology that was introduced into that room was not done by touching any of the furniture. So we had to be very conscious of how we did that specific room. But the rest of it, we really had a liberty and a direction from the client, actually, that he wanted. The chairman, Mr. Chandrasekharan, said he wanted a modern contemporary office that was technologically advanced, but it should also tell a story. So just to also add on to your fact that if you are not restoring the original back, but are modernizing it, we did tell a story a very interesting way. We actually did it through a lot of old archival pictures. If you go to all the floors of Bombay House, we have actually sorted pictures of all the archives of all the different companies. We've also introduced an experience center, which is a digital narrative of the entire company. So there are many ways you can tell a story, even in a very modern interior. So from this beautiful, heritage building, you enter something very contemporary, but the old story is still building through artwork, through technology, and through the people.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. If we can take a few more questions, if there are any.
Yeah, hello. Sorry, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, so, ma'am, thank you for the presentation. Like, it is really informative, and we learn some new things about the renovation kind of stuff. Ma'am, my question is related to the contingent approach for the economics of cultural resources and cultural heritage. Like, when we are thinking and doing the heritage valuation, so how much and how can we rely and how we process the contingent valuation approach for the heritage conservation? That's my question, ma'am.
Sorry, so can you repeat so you're saying again, how do you evaluate, again, this question of evaluating monetarily the heritage value of the building, correct?
Monetarily value, like when we are forming the WTB forms and that contingent valuation method. So sometimes people are saying like that people's thinking and that they are not very specific or something. So what is that middle way to do it properly and more
I
like?
think you're asking the million-dollar question, which is, I think I will share some of the research that I also read. It was very interesting. And this is the eternal conversation, I would say. How do you, and something I brought up earlier, how do you place this value? How do you, what are the parameters that are used to value, these things? So as I mentioned, when you're looking at the economics of it, when you're looking at the valuation of it, there are certain methodologies that are now being shared, whether it's by the Getty Foundation, whether it's by UNESCO, this aspect of aesthetic value, this aspect of, what is the practice that is being conducted, or this aspect of quality of material, or value, social value of the building in the neighborhood. So this quantitative aspects of how we evaluate on what basis is still being determined. But I think there are certain listings that have come up and are being shared. I think this is a constantly evolving process. I think the greatest challenge also is that two buildings are never the same. So, when you're not standardizing, you're not measuring 100 RCC structures which are designed along the same grade, which are using standardized materials. I mean, what a wealth of buildings that are telling us all different things, whether it's the material they've been using, whether it's the water content, whether it is the type of bricks and where they're coming from. I mean, there's just no standardization. So I think we constantly want to standardize, but should we? I mean, should we be open to being more flexible and having a wider set of parametrics to evaluate on? Because that's how conservation is. It's unfortunately not so black and white, and that's its beauty. So I think to answer your question, the parametrics will keep coming, but I think they will also keep evolving. So you'll never get a fixed answer.
Yes. Okay, thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. If there are any more questions, anyone who wishes to ask a question may ask now. I think no one has a question now. I think all the
Thank you
questions
so
have
much.
been
Thank you so much, all, Nandini, especially. I mean, it's really wonderful, mesmerizing again. And thank you so much. Looking forward in future also, you will keep on obliging us. Thank you. Thank you, Poonam ma'am. It was really happy to see you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all students and
Thanks a lot, Nandini. It was a joy to hear you speak through. And may more and more awards and more meaningful projects keep happening through this and making such an important for 40 years. We are so delighted
Thank
to.
you, Poonam. All your blessing. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Dr. Meenakshi.
All the
And
best.
lovely
Bye.
to see all the students as well. Have a lovely
Yes,
weekend,
ma'am.
everyone.
Thank you, ma'am.
Next time.
Everyone, thank you all. Students. Looking forward to seeing you all in person at some point.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.